Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for attending today's launch event for the Child Sexual Exploitation Guidance. I know that everyone has busy diaries, so I very much appreciate people taking the time from the work commitments that you have to join today's event. I think it's very appropriate at the start that we take time to sincerely thank Belle Turner, her team, and the Exploitation thematic group for their professionalism, commitment, and dedication to delivering this guidance. As I understand, a first in Scotland. Many thanks indeed, and I'm sure all colleagues will join me in thanking you all for the work that's been undertaken. Thanks too for Hannah for pulling together the event. These events don't just happen, so thank you, Hannah, to yourself and your team for that. We very much appreciate it. However, it's essential, isn't it, with any new guidance or any new plan or work, that everyone engages with it, that they engage with the team, and collectively we take the guidance forward as we strive to protect the children and young people in the city and beyond. So I would ask you to engage, to participate, not only in this event, but beyond, within your own teams, and feedback on the guidance as we learn from it, as we see the outcomes, and as we self-evaluate to take the whole thing forward. I think the initial work, that hard work, has been done, but it's stage one of the process. So I welcome and encourage you to move that further forward. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Karen.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Campbell. I guess just as what we'll call as a soon-to-be new head of Police Scotland's National Child Abuse Investigation Unit, I'm really quite delighted to be invited along to this launch. As Campbell says, the first of its kind in Scotland. Child sexual exploitation is a real national challenge, probably most memorable to us all was the highly publicised Rotherham inquiry, which took place over a decade ago now. It really reinforced the need for all agencies to have robust and effective responses in place in order to tackle this form of abuse, which can have a devastating impact, severely affecting the children and young people particularly, as in many cases they're not even aware that they're being targeted by offenders. Rotherham was a number of years ago, as I've said, and we've seen similar inquiries in the UK and in Scotland since then. And I guess my question is, do we really understand how prevalent this form of abuse is? Do we really know how many of our children are vulnerable to it? And some of the speakers today will look to give a wee bit of perspective round about this. But as I said, CSE, it's a really complex issue. Understanding how it manifests itself and to what level, that's one of the great challenges that we face. We've seen forms of CSE increase and develop over the years as well, particularly recently, and in relation to cyber crimes, so online abuse or the sharing of indecent images. But without a doubt, it needs to be at the forefront of minds when dealing with children and young people, especially those who may fall victim to it. It's imperative we're all aware of the indicators of CSE and the appropriate actions that we've got to take in terms of our child protection procedures. And for me, that is why this new guidance is really welcomed. So thanks for inviting me, and I'm going to hand over to Belle.
You're on mute, Belle.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm so grateful to Karen for coming, because it's so exciting that we've got an Aberdeen head going up to the head of the National Child Abuse Investigation Unit. What an honour for us as a city. And I know that this is a precious hour that you've given up to do this, so I want to cover as much as we can today. An enormous amount of effort has got to writing this guidance over a long period of time, and I'm genuinely really proud of our city for developing it, and really grateful to all the members of the KEG for their contributions to it. The KEG is a specialist multi-agency group that sits underneath the Aberdeen Child Protection Committee, and amongst our roles, we have responsibility for monitoring and child exploitation in Aberdeen, and then examining whether our response to exploitation across the city is effective. So as chair of the group, I'm really excited not just to launch the guidance, but to really looking forward to seeing what you do with it in practice. We referenced this, Aberdeen being the first local authority to put this kind of guidance out. In fact, we're the first local authority to be implementing findings from the National Complex Abuse and Exploitation Risk Approach. And we've also tried to incorporate aspects of the national guidance for child protection and the accompanying practice insights. So we'll look at the practical challenges that brings later on in the session. One of our primary aims while we were developing the guidance was that while it covers a really complex area of practice, it should be clear and informative and readable. So we've used a simple word equation to support our wider definition of child sexual exploitation in the guidance. CSE is a form of sexual abuse. It occurs where an individual or a group takes advantage of an imbalance of power to coerce, manipulate, or deceive any child or young person under the age of 18 into sexual activity, either for financial advantage or increased status for the perpetrator or the facilitator, or in exchange for something that the victim perceives as a gain. It is a complex form of abuse, and it can be difficult for those working with children to identify it and assess it. Some of the indicators that relate to CSE, for example, particular types of vulnerable behaviours online, we're now seeing at such scale that they might be mistaken for normal adolescent behaviours or categorised as harmful sexual behaviours online rather than identified as exploitation. It requires knowledge, skills, professional curiosity, and an assessment which analyses the risk factors and personal circumstances of individual children to ensure that the signs and symptoms are interpreted correctly and that appropriate support is given. There is no single piece of law that relates to child sexual exploitation. It will often be caught by a number of different legal provisions. And at all times as professionals, therefore, we're seeking to consider and seeking to identify either an action or a pattern of behaviour that's manipulative or coercive or exploitative. This guidance, it really couldn't have come at a more important time, and I want to clearly explain why with reference to the international and national picture first, in the hope that each and every one of you will be able to go back to your service and communicate this to your teams afresh. We have to work together on this issue in Aberdeen now more than ever. As a group, as a KEG, we also want to acknowledge with you that there are real challenges in this area locally, and we want to ask for your help to ensure that this guidance will create meaningful changes in practice and for it to be the start of a bigger conversation. There are huge international and national challenges ahead in the area of how we protect children from and disrupt child sexual exploitation. There's an international market for child sexual abuse material that has grown exponentially during the pandemic, and which we've all got a professional fight to deal with. When I'm not chairing the KEG, I am the director of CyberSafe Scotland, an organisation dedicated to the protection of children online. We have been incredibly fortunate to have Aberdeen as the key hub of our work into online child protection over the last 2 years through a special partnership with the council, which we hope will continue long term. So I see the impact of CSE in our city practically every day and firsthand. My own journey into the world of online child protection started back in 2014 when I was on maternity leave from practicing as a barrister, and I was asked to help the International Justice Mission, the largest anti-trafficking NGO in the world, to examine whether the law in Scotland adequately protected children who were being exploited online and where that abuse was being paid for and live streamed by adults in Scotland. The first case I became involved with was that of a little boy called Marco. Marco lived in Manila in the Philippines, and adults in Scotland were paying as little as 50 pence a day for very specific acts to be done to him on live stream. And today, similar payments and payment patterns remain very hard to detect because they're so small, and we still don't have a technological means of detecting the sexual abuse of a child on a live stream at present. When we are seeking to understand CSE locally, it's vital that we start with the global picture as it directly affects the position here. So to understand it, we have to start with the global position around modern slavery. The United Nations published a report on the global estimates of slavery in September last year. It found that more than 50 million people worldwide were victims of modern slavery in 2021, and more than 12 million of those were children. This is relevant for us today in Aberdeen because of those 50 million men, women and children. The UN estimates that 6.4 million people each and every day are in forced commercial sexual exploitation internationally. We also know that nearly 1.7 million of these are children. And these numbers are estimated to be a tiny fraction of the real number of children in sexual exploitation, both internationally because of difficulties around reporting and here in the United Kingdom, a theme that we'll come back to later. The abuse of those children is largely purchased by adults online in Western countries. Just this year, the Internet Watch Foundation estimated that up to 850,000 adults in the UK alone currently have a sexual interest in children. It's only by understanding these numbers that we can consider and understand how normalised certain behaviours have become, how difficult it is to disrupt the demand side of CSE, and how this impacts the picture around CSE locally. In practice, it's also enormously difficult to measure the number of children who are exploited in person and online because the abuse so often just goes undiscovered. But let's be very clear, CSE is a global crime and those 1.7 million victims exist because of the marketplace for material involving children, mainly at scale online. And that marketplace exists here in Aberdeen as much as anywhere else. When we're supporting children who've been exploited in Aberdeen, or when we are supporting children struggling with certain behaviours, the root cause of which might be as yet unknown, or when we're considering whether any adult in our practice might be one of those 850,000 with a possible sexual interest in children, we have to be aware of that marketplace driving the abuse in the background, whether it's through mainstream porn sites or niche sites hosting child sexual abuse material, or whether it's through organised networks or through individual conversations and interactions with a vulnerable child online or offline. At some level, the international marketplace drives everything. Demand for content involving the online sexual exploitation of children is worldwide, but it is essentially and primarily driven by a certain number of countries in the West. The UK is the third highest consumer of live stream child abuse in the world. The other worst offenders include America, Australia, and the Netherlands, where a lot of online sexual exploitation of children material is hosted. In my experience, I think that even knowing that, professionals in Scotland have always hoped that somehow Scotland would be some sort of anomaly within the UK figures, a sort of surely not here, surely not us feeling. One of the challenges when trying to educate the public around CSE is that it's stomach churning to consider it. And all the research says that when people are scared, they rarely then take protective actions after they've received information. Part of CyberSafe's work, and I'm sure a theme for many of you too, is to find ways to communicate the seriousness of this situation in a constructive way. Gender is also significant. Nearly 4 out of 5 of those trapped in forced commercial sexual exploitation are women or girls. However, we must not underestimate the number of boys that are involved in sexual exploitation here in Aberdeen and further afield. Boys are being exploited and are also growing up seeing the ways in which their female peers are being treated at the moment, which is already having and can only have future significant consequences. We can also see that children who are questioning their gender identity or who identify as transgender or non-binary are very vulnerable to sexual exploitation in the online and offline space, and that there is a specific marketplace online driving this too. Internationally, there's a strong link between sexual exploitation and trafficking. Half of all trafficking cases reported to the UN involve trafficking for the purpose of commercial sexual exploitation. Internationally and locally, social media and websites are increasingly used to recruit people and to gather the material itself. A child does not have to be physically moved to be trafficked for the purpose of exploitation. They can be moved digitally, from Snapchat to OnlyFans or Instagram, or from Instagram or Roblox to Snapchat, where they can then be asked for photos or videos or to go live. On every level, the risk of sexual exploitation among children has been made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. Internationally, an estimated 10.4 million children, for example, lost at least one parent during the pandemic, out of which 7 million became orphans, and that's left them more vulnerable to abuse in contexts where child support systems are inadequate. But in Aberdeen and in Scotland and elsewhere, children have been spending far more time online, and the way in which they're spending that time has fundamentally shifted. So at CyberSafe, we see more children spending longer time on handheld devices, which are much more difficult to supervise behaviour on. Many more children playing online multiplayer games at an earlier age, younger children joining social media far earlier, and children are experiencing attitudes and behaviours that feed the normalisation of CSE on many platforms, including widely used gaming platforms like Roblox. And many protective messages that were standard before the pandemic no longer apply in a straightforward way to the way they're using online spaces now. The most obvious of these being don't talk to strangers, as interactions with strangers in some form are now built into the majority of the gaming spaces that they use. We are really grateful that Aberdeen Council is supporting us to be able to develop specialist services that respond to this locally. There are currently children in Aberdeen who are being moved digitally and physically for the purpose of sexual exploitation. In some cases, this is from one venue in the city to another, or from a venue in the city to the Shire, or vice versa. And often the purchase of alcohol or drugs or other gifts in those cases is the leverage. While the international marketplace is undoubtedly far larger, there are children in Aberdeen who are the victims of exploitation as we speak, and their exploiters may also be in Aberdeen, or they may be anywhere else in the world. There are other current issues that are further affecting the prevalence of CSE, and including the cost of living crisis, which is increasing vulnerabilities at present, and the fact that the tech sector is still largely unregulated. Judges in Scotland frequently comment on the impact of cloud storage facilities when they're sentencing in cases involving the possession of indecent images of children, reflecting on the fact that 20 years ago a floppy disk might have held only a handful of images, while now an almost infinite volume of material can be stored and redistributed. Some of these advances allow users to leave no forensic trace on the viewing device once an image or video has been viewed. Rapid technological advancements recently, which I hope one day may be used for good, currently include generative AI being used to mass produce and adapt child sexual abuse imagery and handbooks for those seeking to groom children in person and online, while, for example, avoiding language patterns that might alert parental or professional attention. However, as encouragement for us as practitioners, when cases are brought to court, there's a growing understanding of the severity of these offences. And this was why the sentencing in the case of Matthew Bell by Lord Arthurson in 2019 was so significant. Mr. Bell had arranged, ordered and viewed abuse of children very similar to Marco, who I was mentioning earlier, in the Philippines. And the headline in his case was that he had paid 93p for particularly graphic content. Sentencing Bell at the High Court in Glasgow, Lord Arthurson said he had plumbed new depths of depravity and that he would sentence him as though he had carried out the abuse himself. He gave Bell an extended sentence, jailing him for 9 years and ordering him to serve 6 years on licence after his release, which meant he'd be monitored in the community after release. If we in Aberdeen can use the new guidance to record and share information that may relate to CSE wherever we find it, then we will be able to start facilitating the police locally and nationally through Karen and the NCAIU to then enable more cases to be prosecuted effectively in this way. Something small we are able to identify with respect to one child may have a huge impact for other children elsewhere. Often when we're supporting children locally, we don't know how a child is supported, how a child we support, is connected with other children from other groups. What they may have shared online, or what has really happened to an image that they've shared, or how someone that has been contacting them may have contacted hundreds or thousands of others simultaneously. The only way those connections can be made is if we have a significant increase in the reporting and recording of information that relates or may relate to a risk of CSE locally. The number of sexual crimes recorded by the police in Scotland increased by 15% last year to 15,049, and at least 37% of these relate to a victim under the age of 18. However, we know that these figures don't reflect the scale of CSE in Scotland or internationally, and to change this, we need to radically raise awareness of the issue in order that we can bring forward more information to the police. Children account for more than 1 in 4 of all persons subjected to forced commercial sexual exploitation, and this is a specific area requiring urgent attention. So we're now going to have a pause from me, and we're going to hear from Zoe Galloway from Bernardo's in Aberdeen with frontline reflections on CSE in the city, and then from DI Ryan Morris bringing us the frontline and strategic police perspective. I know it will be interesting for you to hear their perspectives, and I hope it will be especially interesting to hear them back to back, as they show some of the local challenges we need to move on to address. I've put the aims of the guidance up here now so that we can think about how those aims relate to what Zoe and Ryan are saying. And after they've spoken, then I'll be back and we'll look at the guidance in more detail to identify how we can respond to these challenges positively and proactively in Aberdeen.
Sorry, Belle, you glitched then, but I think you were handing over to Ryan.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. I know a lot of names that's on the event this afternoon. For those that don't know me, I'm Ryan Morris. I'm a detective inspector at the Public Protection Unit of the Police, and I've got responsibility for the child protection portfolio, and up until recently managed the IRD desk and the new joint interview team. I'd like to be asked along just to kind of speak a little bit about CSE from a local perspective and some of the challenges that we face in Aberdeen. I think we'll all agree from each of the speakers we've heard about CSE is a lot more prevalent than what we're currently recording in the city. And what we're definitely not seeing is that kind of prevalence being transferred into IRD discussions about young people. To give you an idea, from the 1st of January to the 31st of April this year, we've only held one IRD under the banner of CSE. I mean, that does come with a caveat of our IRD system is set up to highlight only the main area of concern, which we're discussing children. But of those 124 IRDs that we've had, 26 of them alone have related to sexual abuse. Now, I would be of the opinion that every sexual abuse IRD that we have has the potential to be CSE. What I do want to say, though, is that we do have a very good, robust IRD process in the North East, and I'm absolutely certain that the new guidance that's being launched today will help us identify CSE. Like I said, every IRD that we hold has the potential to be CSE, in my opinion. Thankfully, the majority don't turn out to be, but I think we'll all agree that the issue is more prevalent than what we're currently recording in the city. Within the last year, I think it was just October last year, we launched a new IRD document for the North East, whereby we included 2 boxes in there under exploitation and harmful behaviours, which is really kind of forcing practitioners to discuss these issues and record any rationale and to show that we're considering them. What I do want to say from the outset, which is really important, harmful behaviours in no way, shape or form can be viewed or should be approached as victim blaming. Harmful behaviours is looking at red flags that we can look to identify in young people when we're looking to tackle CSE. I sit on the quality assurance group for IRDs in Aberdeen City, and they are generally very, very positively recorded. And like I said, the criteria that we are starting to look at now as part of that QA is exploitation and harmful behaviours. So we want to see professionals rationalising these. And it may be the case that within the exploitation box, we are putting down that there's no indication of CSE mean time, but we are considering it. What I do think that also is an area that we can look to work on is taking some of these sexual abuse IRDs back to a reconvened IRD. So like I said, it might not be obvious at the outset that CSE is an issue, but of those 26 that we have between January and April, I would be of the opinion at least maybe 1 or 2 of them had led to further CSE concerns after joint interview. So I think we probably just need to get a bit sharper or discussing whether we need to come back to the IRD to discuss maybe other red flags that's been identified. And one of the things, so that's fine when we come to an IRD, and I think it's important when speaking about IRDs and CSE, the child doesn't have to have had been harmed, it's about being at risk of harm. Okay, so a lot of these sexual abuse IRDs that we are holding is after the child has made a disclosure of being harmed. So if you do have any concerns that a child has been a victim of CSE or there's red flags, then yeah, contact your supervisor, contact social work, police, and it is about sharing information. We may not always have an IRD, nor may it be justified at the outset, but my advice would be not to sit in the concern or a red flag. It could form part of a bigger picture that we, the police, are looking at. And yet we might not have a full-blown child protection investigation, but these concerns are recorded, and should they continue to arise, not just for that child, but for other children, it's useful information for us to have. Just about every learning review that we're still involved in always speaks about how information could have been shared a bit earlier, and I don't think that's any different when it comes to CSE. Certainly from a police point of view, I would rather have a chat at an early outset and not have an IRD if it's not required, as opposed to letting something grow to crisis point where we do have to have an IRD because that is not in the benefit of that child, and that's not a trauma-informed approach for them. I do want to highlight, just on the back of what Detective Superintendent McKellar had said, and Bell, CSE isn't a issue that's reserved for a certain demographic of child. It can happen to any child from any home or any background, and we've had experience of that in Aberdeen City. Technology and social media has changed how children can be exploited. We've had many examples of instances where the abuse has happened entirely online, with the child never meeting the person who exploited them. The final point I'd want to make is don't be put off by false perceptions that children won't speak to us. I'm heavily involved in a joint interview training, and one of the things that I always look to challenge in IRDs, or if someone says, oh, but that child won't speak to you, okay, that's a negative perception. We've a lot of good supports in place for children in the North East and in Aberdeen, through certainly within the police, our partnerships and preventions team, our new SCIM team, social work, education. And it might be the case that that child's not ready to disclose to us just now, but we can make approaches to them. We can look to forge relationships so that one day, hopefully, they will be able to speak to us. But what I do want to stress is, although it's an important part of a child protection investigation, the joint interview is only part of it. So we don't need necessarily the child always to speak to us in order to have an investigation with an outcome whereby we're bringing offenders to justice. And I just want to kind of finish with an example. One of my colleagues, Mark McRobb, who's also on the call, he supervised an inquiry in Aberdeen. And whilst I don't make any apologies for it being relatively hard hitting, I think it does dispel the myth around that we need a child to be able to speak to us in order to tackle CSE. So in September 2020, Police Scotland received the report of a 70-year-old male having had sexually assaulted an 8-year-old boy at his home address in Aberdeen. During an investigation, it was learned that children in the local area would frequent the male's address. The male had pets the children would visit. Some of the children spoke about being given money to spend at local shops and being told not to tell their parents. Others spoke about being given food such as sweets or chocolates. The parents were all aware that their children frequented the address, but no concerns were ever raised prior to the disclosure of the 8-year-old boy. Through the investigation, it came to light that the male had committed further sexual offences on children all aged between 8 and 12. The male's home address was searched. During that search, the evidence that the male had committed serious sexual offences against children was recovered. The children were quickly identified as local to the area, and some of these children have never been able to speak to us in the police, social work, nor anyone else about what's happened to them. It's not just the case, like I said, that they haven't told authorities, they haven't told their parents, they haven't told any friends or family. The male in question was arrested, charged with serious sexual offences against children, for which he received an 8-year custodial sentence. I think we'd all agree that there's no doubt that an inquiry like that is CSE, and hopefully it does dispel the myths of what some people think CSE tends to be, but hopefully it reiterates that we don't always need a JI or disclosure from a child to tackle CSE. And really, that's kind of all the parts that I want to cover. The main message being, if you do have doubts, please raise them. If you've got concerns, please raise them. I can't stress that enough. And if anyone's got any kind of questions or queries around the IRD and how we tackle CSE or sexual abuse, please reach out to myself either through Belle or through Hannah. Thank you.
I know child sexual exploitation is becoming more prevalent, as the children we support already experience a number of vulnerabilities, and it's these vulnerabilities that put them at risk of exploitation, especially as initially they may be receiving something they like or want. We are continuing to experience a growing number of children showing signs and indicators, and in some cases disclosing that they are being sexually exploited. It's difficult to fully understand the scope of child sexual exploitation within Aberdeen City, and even harder for children themselves to understand when they are being exploited. We know from working with children, they do not always believe that sexual exploitation is happening to them, and find it very difficult to make a disclosure of any concerns due to the fear of the outcome. Children continue to feel a sense of responsibility for the harm caused to them, and fear the attitudes of others around them if they were to make a disclosure. We need to ensure that we see children as victims of sexual exploitation. We need this guidance because it will support us to think about what we need to do to make a child feel safer and how we respond as adults around the child. The guidance provides the tools to equip us with the knowledge of shared processes and responses that will allow the child to feel able to confide in safe adults around them. The guidance demonstrates the importance of building a picture of concerns, including signs and indicators, as well as other factors that may put a child at risk of exploitation. It embeds the use of a common understanding among professionals for the need to discuss, record, and share concerns that a child is being or is at risk of being exploited. As well, it equips us to feel more confident when we do believe that a child may be being sexually exploited and what steps we need to take to prevent this from happening.
In this half of the session, we're going to be focusing more on the practical, and we wanted you to hear those insights from Ryan and Zoe first so that you can really understand the challenge that we have locally. It is important to note that it's the same challenge that will be experienced in all other local authorities in Scotland, but we really want Aberdeen to lead the way in responding to it. As Zoe described, some agencies know that CSE is happening at a certain level in Aberdeen, but that level is not currently reflected in the police and the social work figures. We don't know at this stage whether that gap is because practitioners are struggling to identify child sexual exploitation, or whether risks of CSE are being identified, but there are barriers to escalating concerns, or whether the gap is mainly resulting from an issue with how we're recording CSE and whether CSE or an elevated risk of CSE is being clearly identified in records. And it's perhaps likely that it's a combination of all three. We need your help to identify which of those issues, if any, may be relevant to your service. Once you've identified that, we'll ask each service to consider what further support might be needed as a result. And we'll ask you to share those needs with us as the KEG so that we can consider whether we or the Child Protection Committee can provide further support. Another key focus of the new guidance is that we need every service in Aberdeen to help us to promote the importance of recording and reporting every single concern. There, we need to recognise barriers to identifying child sexual exploitation from the professional perspective. Insights that have come to the Child Exploitation Group through the ACC training have included that professionals still have concerns around not knowing how to report, fears around misidentifying behaviours as exploitative, and fears that if a practitioner raises something or raises the possibility that something is exploitation, it will trigger interventions or invoke consequences that stop the positive work they're doing directly with the child. In each service, we have to identify, talk about, and fully understand these fears. What are the barriers to disclosure in your service? What are the barriers from the perspective of the child, but also vitally, what are the barriers from the perspective of your professionals? Other important questions to ask include whether you have regular discussions around current examples of exploitation and how it's changing month to month. Do you have an open environment where people can raise concerns about the impact of reporting? Again, could you consider sharing principles from what is shared from your professionals back to the Child Exploitation Group? What we really want is for Aberdeen to become a place where we acknowledge the complexity of this area and the fast-paced changes in it, and we identify these issues. We expressly acknowledge that this approach should lead to an increase in the number of reported incidents in the city in the short and medium term. Another key issue for the new guidance is that we also know there's a local and a Scotland-wide issue relating to 16 and 17-year-olds. A 16 or 17-year-old is still a child for the purpose of considering whether they have been exploited. This is because even where a young person is old enough to legally consent to sexual activity, that consent is only valid where they make a choice and they have the freedom and capacity to make that choice. If a child feels they've got no other meaningful choice, or if they're being bought or manipulated or under the influence of harmful substances, or if they're at some level fearful of what might happen if they don't comply, all of which are common features in cases of child sexual exploitation, then consent cannot legally be given whatever the age of the child. It's important to note that we've moved away from checklists in the old guidance, but we have incorporated lots of practical insights about what questions to ask. We acknowledge practitioners may prefer checklists and that individual services may still choose to use them, but the Chiara approach showed that when we rely too heavily on them, we lose the importance of practitioner curiosity, instinct, and a developing conversation with practitioners. To support these key areas of focus in the new guidance, we have clearly explained within the guidance the need to continuously promote intervention as early as possible. We've included lots of practical insights from the national guidance. For example, on page 5 of the new guidance, we've got specific excerpts from the practice insights with an important emphasis on the fact that the child has to know that what they've experienced isn't normal, has to expect to be believed, and has to believe that something can be done about it. Children or young people who are being or have been sexually exploited are reliant on adults to make the assessment and put support in place. A lot of important focus is on the fact that the child may never ever identify an experience as exploitative. We have to create environments where they feel safe to share their experiences and then do that for them. There are many reasons that practitioner curiosity is so important. In cases of child sexual exploitation, what qualifies as perceived gain for the child can be exceptionally wide. In recent cases locally, we've seen it's frequently been the prevention of something negative. For example, if a child shares intimate images to stop someone carrying out a threat, to try to prevent the sharing of images that have already been sent or the disclosure of something to their parent or guardian. Further, as we've already said in the guidance, the unequal power dynamic in which exploitation occurs means that the normalised nature of the interaction or the receipt of something by the child or young person of any age may make the child feel that they're in control of a situation or are benefiting from it rather than being oppressed or injured by it. Another reason is that we must recognise that disclosure by the child or young person is exceptionally rare. As practitioners, we have to be able to join the dots between elements of circumstance to recognise exploitative actions and patterns of behaviour and the impact of those on the child, and then not only forward report these as priority number 1, but also translate them into a contextual safeguarding approach. We have prioritised a focus on contextual safeguarding in the new guidance. So contextual safeguarding at its heart is about prioritising a focus on the conditions that facilitate abuse locally. To give you an example from the online space, if we become aware that one child in a social group has been accessing Omegle, for example, and has had images requested of them on that platform, then level 1 looks at how we are developing an understanding of that space, of that particular platform. So what features of the platform facilitate the abuse? How often are certain patterns happening? Are there settings available that reduce harm? Even if there are, are they in use or could they be put into use? Is the peer group around the child in that online space working to protect the child, or are there group behaviours in that particular space that are actually exacerbating the risk of CSE? So this level might sometimes involve reaching out to a partner like CyberSafe to ask those questions, or it might be something that you do in-house as a team. Level 2 of contextual safeguarding then looks at how we are sharing that information in our team or in our service, or more widely as a child protection system in Aberdeen, as opposed to how we are using it to support building parental capacity with an individual family or child at level 1. So level 2 again is how are we feeding it through to individuals and organisations with a reach into other contexts, local youth clubs or education, and also then how are we measuring the impact of that contextually. To use an offline example, if there's an area of Aberdeen where children and young people have become increasingly vulnerable to exploitation, a similar contextual safeguarding approach at level 1 looks at how do we map that physical space and understand that space? How and at what times of day are children travelling to it? What are they doing once they get there? How long are they there for? who is inviting them to go there, and what protective factors already exist in that space. So what services are already regularly visiting that space, etc. And then level 2 looks at how are we sharing that information across local services. Are we sharing it across all youth work services, street pastors, police, education, local shops and services? And then how are we measuring the impact and response to that contextually? Do we have more patrols in the area? Do we have more reports coming in from the streets, etc.? So then we have more, do we have more of a focus on support at a particular time of day or night? And we know that that is an issue that we've seen recurring over the last 24 months, where particular physical areas of Aberdeen have become an area that needs an additional level of support. So before I wrap up, there was one further area that I wanted to draw out, and that's a parallel between this and a comment that Ryan made earlier. So historically and nationally in the UK, we know that CSE has been missed, where elements of children's behaviour have been treated as normal teenage behaviour. And I think this is happening again around image sharing and child-generated live-streamed abuse. Of the 255,571 web pages that the Internet Watch Foundation confirmed to contain child sexual abuse imagery last year, only 11% of those seem to have been expressly produced for the purpose of financial gain by the distributor. Far more looked on the face of it like behaviour that was independently generated by the child, even though we know that there would have been an exploitative element of other individuals driving it, requesting images, calling the child to the camera, etc., in the vast majority of cases. So we can use that to help us to understand that every practitioner will always need to consider child exploitation if the child has shared an image online in any context. They will always have to consider exploitation if a child has been asked to share an image, if they've been asked to approach the camera, even if they have refused to do that or an image has not been shared. And so finally, here are our big asks today. Please, please widely share the new guidance. If you can tag Cybersafety Scotland or myself in any posts, then I can help you reshare them. And the council will help us to reshare those too. And I've included my details there. I hope this has been helpful, and we'll move on now to a brief question and answer session with Hannah Bennett, the training lead for Aberdeen, and Julia Milne, Whole Systems Approach.
Comments coming from Kirsty, who's actually part of our Learning and Development Subcommittee. So I know Kirsty well. Let's see what Kirsty said. Just a thought more than a question. I know we're talking about the C in child sexual exploitation, but I'm just thinking about our care experienced young people being potentially more vulnerable to CSE, our responsibilities to our care experienced young people into their early adulthood, the promise work being undertaken, and how well we manage these situations when the young person is over 18 but has been in an exploitative situation since they were under 18, and how well our links to and working practitioners are with adult protection services professionals work. That is a question. That is a long question. I think feel free to come in, Julia and Belle, on this, but I think there's definitely work to be done, and I think everyone involved in the Child Protection Committee, Adult Protection Committee would agree that there needs to be more joint working between the two services. But that's partly what Aberdeen Protects was built for, the website, and there's still work going on to try and integrate and merge those two services, making transitions easier as children grow up and obviously past the age of 18. But I think there's still work to be done. Julia, I don't know if you want to come in to discuss over 18s, just thinking about your work around laws.
I don't know if I've got much to add to what you've said there, Hannah. I think you're right. I think there are links there, but more to be done. And I think, you know, Belle mentioned 16, 17-year-olds and how we can forget that they're still children, and we can forget the vulnerabilities of those young adults that are just over 18. And I think we're moving towards a better picture, but there, yeah, we've still got some way to go to perfect all of that.
Yeah, I think the point that I would add would be that if we think to the national guidance and we think about the importance of the child or the young person feeling that they'll be believed, but feeling that there'll be an action that follows from what they're sharing, then the real challenge, I suppose, once a child reaches the age of 18 is that we're going to lose that legal protection. There might be some laws that are still relevant though, because of course, there's going to be, you know, when we think about the Protection from Abuse and Harassment Act, for example, we'll still have that legal protection. There's going to be other potential legal protections available, but we're going to lose a lot of the legal protections that will be, you know, available to us in the first instance. So it's really important that how then do we make sure that that young person has that experience of knowing there's going to be action, because that's such a key part of that's such a key part of it.
I think Ryan's highlighted something really useful in the chat there. An IRD recently for 17-year-old adult services present. I presume that's thinking about as that young person gets older, so they're already aware of what other services are available to them once they're post 18. So yeah, there are good things happening.
Anyone got any other questions? You can unmute if you'd prefer. Campbell.
Well, thanks again to yourself and everyone for the presentations. You reference in an international picture, a national picture, and a local picture. The guidance has been launched locally, but I just wonder, you know, and that's a starting point for us, as I alluded earlier, in relation to how we take it to our teams, how we use it, how it's evaluated, and so on and so forth. But with your other links, do you have consideration for how it may be further rolled out across Scotland to give a consistent approach?
Oh, that's a good question, which I might ask Karen's advice on later. I think it'd be really wonderful. I mean, it has taken us an enormous amount of time to produce this guidance because we've worked on it so hard, like to really try and understand all the elements of it. And I think it'd be really wonderful if it was adopted widely across Scotland, and if we could raise this type of awareness across Scotland around how these puzzle pieces fit together. Because yeah, that would be a fantastic opportunity, and it would really reflect the work that's gone in Aberdeen.
Just to come in on the back of what Belle said, Campbell, I'm part of the National Learning and Development Group, and we've now got June Welsh, who's been appointed as the National Learning and Development Lead for CELSIS. She's part of CELSIS, but obviously works for, well, Scotland in terms of child protection, learning and development, and she's currently developing lots of national, like level 1 and level 2 child protection safeguarding training courses that are for everyone, and I'm sure she would be a good person to speak to about down the road when she's been in post longer and we've kind of got the basics covered. Certainly there is a relationship to be had with sharing this guidance widely with her, and help, because she would be the one to help us distribute it and make it a model that would work for other local authority areas. So yeah, absolutely, I would contact June Welsh for further discussion on that.
And if any of the individual services on the call, if there's ever an opportunity to share this, like within your service at a national level, that would be fantastic. And yeah, we do. We've got a unique, I'm really proud of our KEG here. We've got a unique kind of combination of expertise on the group. And I think we are in a position to speak to this at a national and international level because of that. So that would be amazing.
Are there any more questions from anyone? No. Okay. Well, then, thank you very much for coming. I hope you found that launch interesting, and that you managed to carve out some time in the coming weeks to give the new guidance a proper read through. I'll send it to you. I've got a copy of it now, so I'll send it out to everyone immediately after this call's over. It's really important for the success of this guidance and our continuing commitment to tackling CSE in Aberdeen that everyone here please takes 5 minutes to complete a very short post-launch survey that I've put together that asks you one question, one important question, and that is, how will you ensure that this guidance is effectively disseminated and adopted within your service? And then what will happen is a few professionals in 3 or 4 months, so way down the line, but a few professionals who have attended today will then be randomly selected in a couple of months' time for us to follow up with and see how this guidance has been used to support young people and improve their future outcomes. So I'm going to just share that survey in the chat now, and if I could ask everyone here to please complete that, that would be really appreciated when you get a second. Like I say, it's only 5 minutes, so hopefully you'll get a chance to complete that shortly. Okay, I'm just checking nothing else has come in the chat. I don't think it has. So if you could all complete that survey for us, just answering that one question, it's really vital that the Child Exploitation Group get your responses to that. And like I said, I'll make sure that I share the guidance with everyone now this afternoon, so you've got a copy of it fresh. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to comment before we wind up? No? Okay. In that case, then, thank you so much for joining us. I think that was a really worthwhile hour that we've spent together, and I'll be in touch now shortly with the guidance. And you can, of course, ask any questions you've got there, respond to my email, and we'll happily answer anything that comes in. Okay, thanks everyone.